Diana Kowalski had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. At 32, she moved through the fluorescent-lit corridors of Riverside Medical Center like a whisper, her auburn hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her scrubs pristine but unremarkable. Her petite 5'4" frame seemed to blend into the hospital's beige walls, and her voice rarely rose above the gentle tone she used to comfort patients during the graveyard shift. To most of the day staff at Riverside Medical Center, she was just another night nurse, the quiet one who always volunteered for the worst shifts, who never complained about difficult patients, and who somehow always managed to keep her section running smoothly while chaos erupted around her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of her colleagues knew, what nobody bothered to ask about, was the small compass tattoo hidden beneath her left sleeve, a faded reminder of 8 years as a Special Forces medic with the call sign Falcon. The woman who now spent her nights checking IVs and administering medications had once been Staff Sergeant Diana Kowalski, a combat veteran with 3 tours in hostile territory and more confirmed neutralizations than she cared to remember. The emergency department buzzed with its usual 3 a.m. chaos as Diana made her rounds through the cardiac wing. She moved with the precision that most attributed to years of nursing experience, but the truth was more complex. Every step was calculated, every glance surveyed potential threats and escape routes, every sound was cataloged and analyzed by instincts honed in the mountains of Afghanistan. While other nurses saw a hallway, Diana saw choke points and cover positions. While others heard the ambient noise of a busy hospital, she detected the subtle changes in tone that might indicate danger. "Diana, room 314 needs another morphine push," called out Nurse Carlos Mendez, one of the few night shift staff who treated her more than furniture. Carlos was a good man, a former paramedic who understood the weight of responsibility that came with holding someone's life in your hands. He'd been kind to her since her first day 3 years ago, when she'd appeared at Riverside with impeccable credentials and a recommendation letter that asked no questions about her previous career. "Copy that," Diana replied, the military terminology slipping out before she caught herself. Carlos raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He'd noticed these small verbal quirks before, the way she said Roger instead of okay, how she instinctively called directions using compass bearings, and the way she always positioned herself with a clear view of all entrances when they worked together at the nurses' station. As Diana prepared the medication, her trained eye automatically surveyed the ward. Room 314 contained Mr. Hoffman, a 67-year-old post-surgical patient recovering from a complex cardiac procedure. Rooms 315 through 318 housed similar high-acuity patients, each connected to monitors that would alert the staff to any changes in their conditions. The cardiac wing was always kept slightly separate from the main emergency department, a design feature that most staff appreciated for its quieter environment, but one that Diana recognized as a potential tactical liability. Limited exits, concentrated high-value targets, minimal security presence. She shook her head, trying to suppress the automatic threat assessments that her mind performed constantly. This was Riverside Medical Center in downtown Portland, not a forward operating base in Kandahar. These were patients, not assets to protect. The biggest threat she faced here was Dr. Frederick Brennan's condescending attitude during his monthly night rounds, not insurgents with improvised explosive devices. "Nurse Kowalski," Dr. Brennan's voice cut through the ambient noise as he approached the medication station. "I reviewed your incident report from last week regarding the security concerns you raised. I have to say, your observations of suspicious individuals conducting surveillance seem rather imaginative." Diana felt the familiar knot form in her stomach. Last Tuesday, she'd noticed 3 men in the hospital lobby for consecutive nights, each claiming to visit different patients but displaying behavior patterns that triggered every alarm in her Special Forces-trained mind. They moved with military bearing, their eyes constantly swept for cameras and security positions, and their stories about visiting relatives contained inconsistencies that suggested reconnaissance rather than genuine concern for patients. "Sir, I documented specific behavioral indicators that suggested..." Nurse Kowalski, Dr. Brennan interrupted, his tone carrying the dismissive authority of someone who'd never had to question whether his next decision might cost lives. Your job is to monitor patients and administer medications, not to play security consultant. These men were probably just anxious family members dealing with the stress of having loved ones in the hospital. Perhaps you've been watching too many thriller movies during your downtime.
The dismissal stung, but Diana had learned to swallow her pride during 3 years of civilian life. She nodded professionally and returned to her medication preparation, but her mind continued processing the threat indicators she'd observed. The surveillance pattern had been too systematic, too professional for grieving relatives. She'd seen similar reconnaissance operations conducted by hostile forces before engaging high-value targets in medical facilities overseas. Carlos appeared beside her as Dr. Brennan moved on to terrorize other staff members. "Don't let him get to you," he said quietly. "Brennan thinks his medical degree makes him an expert on everything. Some of us actually listen when you point out problems." "Thanks, Carlos. I notice things, patterns that seem off." "Where'd you develop that kind of observational training?" Carlos asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than casual conversation. Diana paused, her hands steady as she double-checked the medication dosage. For a moment, she considered telling him the truth about the 8 years she'd spent in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, about the specialized training that had taught her to read human behavior like a survival manual, about the missions where noticing the wrong kind of pattern meant the difference between coming home and being shipped back in a flag-draped box. Instead, she offered the same carefully neutral response she'd perfected over 3 years. "You pick up things when you work nights long enough. People behave differently when they think nobody's watching." It wasn't entirely a lie. People did behave differently during the graveyard shift when they thought the hospital's attention was focused elsewhere. But Diana's ability to detect deception, assess threats, and predict human behavior came from training that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with staying alive in hostile territory. As she walked toward room 314 with Mr. Hoffman's medication, she caught her reflection in the darkened window overlooking the hospital's main entrance. For just a moment, she saw not the quiet night nurse who'd spent 3 years trying to disappear, but Staff Sergeant Diana Kowalski, call sign Falcon, who had once been considered one of the most effective Special Forces medics in her unit. The transformation had been deliberate. After her final tour, after too many friends lost and too many impossible decisions made under fire, she'd requested discharge and enrolled in an accelerated nursing program. She'd wanted to use her medical training to save lives rather than take them, to work in a place where healing was the primary mission rather than a secondary objective. The transition from military to civilian life had been challenging, but she'd found genuine peace in the routine of patient care, in the simple satisfaction of helping people recover from illness and injury. But some skills, once learned, never really fade, and some instincts, honed by years of survival in hostile environments, continue operating whether you want them to or not. As Diana administered Mr. Hoffman's medication and checked his vital signs, she found herself automatically noting the room's tactical layout, the position of medical equipment that could serve as improvised weapons, and the fact that the cardiac wing's isolation made it an ideal target for anyone wanting to cause maximum psychological impact with minimum security interference. She finished her rounds and returned to the nurse's station, settling into the routine paperwork that occupied the quieter hours of the night shift. Around her, Riverside Medical Center continued its 24-hour mission of healing, its staff focused on the immediate needs of patients who trusted them with their lives and recovery. None of them knew that their quiet night nurse had once called in airstrikes, performed surgery under fire, and eliminated threats with the same steady hands she now used to start IVs and comfort frightened patients. Diana had chosen this life deliberately, traded the adrenaline and danger of Special Forces operations for the predictable rhythm of civilian nursing. She'd found her peace in this new identity, in being someone who healed rather than someone who killed when necessary. But peace, she was about to discover was a luxury that depended on other people's willingness to leave you alone. And sometimes, whether you wanted it or not, the past came looking for you in ways that made your current identity irrelevant. The skills that had made her Falcon were still there, dormant but intact, waiting beneath the surface of Diana Kowalski, night nurse. In less than 4 hours, those skills would be the only thing standing between 17 innocent patients and a coordinated terrorist attack designed to send a message that would echo far beyond the walls of Riverside Medical Center.
3 years ago, Diana Kowalski had walked away from a life that most people couldn't imagine, and few would ever know about. Staff Sergeant Diana Kowalski, call sign Falcon, had been part of an elite Special Forces medical unit that operated in the gray areas between official military action and classified operations that never appeared in any public record. Her team had been inserted into hostile territory across 3 continents, providing emergency medical support for missions where failure meant more than career consequences. It meant body bags and international incidents. The transition hadn't happened overnight. During her final tour in Afghanistan, Diana had found herself increasingly disconnected from the violence that defined her daily existence. She joined the military to serve her country and help people, drawn by the Special Forces medical program that promised she could save lives in the most challenging environments possible. For 6 years, that mission had sustained her through firefights, improvised explosive devices, and the constant pressure of operating in areas where American forces weren't supposed to exist. But the breaking point had come during a classified operation in the mountains near the Pakistani border. Her team had been providing medical support for a reconnaissance mission when they'd been ambushed by a well-organized insurgent force. The engagement had lasted 14 hours, with Diana alternating between treating wounded team members and returning fire against an enemy that seemed to know exactly where they were and how they operated. She'd saved 7 lives that day, performing field surgery under fire while coordinating defensive positions and calling in close air support. Her actions had earned her a commendation that would never appear in her official record, and the respect of operators who rarely acknowledged anyone outside their immediate unit. But they'd also cost her something she couldn't quantify, a piece of her soul that had been worn away by too many life-and-death decisions made in situations where there were no good choices. The final straw had been holding Sergeant Mike Torres while he died from injuries that should have been survivable. Torres had been 23 years old, engaged to a teacher from his hometown in Texas, and counting down the days until his rotation home. Diana had done everything right, applied pressure to control the bleeding, established an airway, and administered the appropriate medications, but she'd been forced to choose between saving Torres and providing covering fire that had prevented 3 other team members from being overrun. She'd made the tactical decision, the one that saved more lives and ensured mission success. Torres had died while she engaged targets that were threatening the rest of the team. It was the right choice, the professional choice, the choice that any competent Special Forces medic would have made in the same situation. But it was also the choice that had convinced her she couldn't continue making similar decisions without losing everything that made her human. The request for discharge had surprised her commanding officers. Colonel Rachel Cross, her team leader and mentor, had tried to convince her to consider alternative assignments that might address her concerns without ending her military career. "Falcon," Cross had said during their final meeting, "you're one of the most effective combat medics I've ever worked with. The combination of your medical skills and tactical abilities makes you irreplaceable in certain situations." "That's exactly the problem, ma'am," Diana had replied. "I don't want to be irreplaceable at killing people. I want to be useful at saving them." "You do save people. Every mission you complete successfully saves lives, our people and civilians who benefit from our operations." Diana had looked out the window of Cross's office at the base where she'd spent the last 3 years of her life. "With respect, ma'am, I want to save people who aren't carrying weapons. I want to work in a place where the primary mission is healing, not eliminating threats." The transition to civilian life had been more challenging than she had anticipated. Her Special Forces training had given her medical knowledge that exceeded most civilian emergency room physicians, but explaining how she had acquired that expertise without revealing classified information required careful navigation. The nursing program had been a logical choice. Her existing medical skills had allowed her to complete the coursework in 18 months rather than the traditional 4 years, and the profession offered the opportunity to help people without the moral complexity of military operations. Riverside Medical Center had hired her based on her exceptional performance during clinical rotations and a recommendation letter from a Veterans Affairs physician who understood the value of her background without requiring specific details. Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the hospital's chief of staff, had been a Navy doctor before transitioning to civilian practice, and she'd recognized the signs of someone whose military medical experience far exceeded what appeared in their official transcripts. "We need good nurses," Dr. Santos had said during Diana's final interview. "People who can stay calm under pressure, make good decisions when situations deteriorate, and work effectively as part of a team. Your references suggest you have those qualities in abundance."
Diana had accepted the position and deliberately chosen the night shift in the cardiac wing, an assignment that most nurses avoided due to its demanding patients and relative isolation from the main emergency department. She'd wanted the quiet, the routine, the opportunity to focus on patient care without the political complications that came with day shift responsibilities. For 3 years, she'd found exactly what she'd been looking for: meaningful work that allowed her to use her medical skills while maintaining the emotional distance she needed to heal from her military experiences. But some aspects of her Special Forces training had proven impossible to suppress completely. She still woke up every morning at 05:30, regardless of when she'd gone to sleep. She still performed physical training that maintained the conditioning and reflexes that had kept her alive in hostile environments. She still cleaned and maintained the Sig Sauer P320 she kept in a biometric safe in her apartment, not because she expected to need it, but because the routine of weapons maintenance had become a form of meditation that helped her process the stress of her new civilian responsibilities. Most importantly, she still noticed things that other people missed: the way patients' family members positioned themselves when they visited, the unconscious behavior patterns that suggested deception or concealed aggression, the subtle changes in routine that might indicate security vulnerabilities or potential threats. Her colleagues attributed these observations to general nursing experience, not understanding that Diana's awareness had been honed in environments where failing to notice the wrong detail could result in catastrophic consequences. The incident reports she'd filed about suspicious individuals conducting apparent surveillance of the hospital had been her attempt to use those skills constructively. She documented specific behavioral indicators that suggested the men she'd observed were conducting reconnaissance rather than visiting patients. Their movement patterns, their apparent familiarity with security camera locations, and their coordinated timing suggested professional training and hostile intent. But Dr. Brennan's dismissive response had reminded her why she'd chosen to hide her background rather than reveal it. Civilian administrators didn't want to hear about threat assessments from nurses, regardless of those nurses' qualifications to make such assessments. They wanted medical professionals who focused on patient care and left security concerns to designated personnel who often lacked the training to recognize sophisticated threats. So, Diana had returned to her routine of quiet observation and professional competence, filing her reports and hoping that someone with appropriate authority would take her concerns seriously. She'd learned to live with the constant low-level anxiety that came from seeing potential threats that others couldn't recognize, accepting it as the price of maintaining the peaceful civilian life she'd chosen over the constant adrenaline of Special Forces operations. As she settled into the nurses' station for another quiet night at Riverside Medical Center, Diana had no way of knowing that her careful observations had been accurate, that the men she'd reported were indeed conducting surveillance, and that the reconnaissance had been preparation for an operation that would test every skill she'd acquired during 8 years of serving in the most dangerous places on Earth. In less than 3 hours, Diana Kowalski would discover that some choices you make in life are temporary, while others define who you are regardless of the circumstances you find yourself in. She'd chosen to be a healer rather than a warrior, but she was about to learn that sometimes those roles become inseparable when innocent lives hang in the balance. The first sign of trouble came at 4:17 a.m., but nobody except Diana recognized it as such. She was completing her medication rounds when she noticed Carlos standing at the main nurse's station, frowning at the security monitor that displayed feeds from cameras throughout the cardiac wing. His expression carried the kind of concern that experienced medical professionals developed when something felt wrong but couldn't be clearly identified. "What's got your attention?" Diana asked, setting down her medication cart and moving to where she could see the monitors clearly. "Probably nothing," Carlos replied, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. "Security called about 10 minutes ago asking if we'd seen anyone unusual in the ward tonight. Apparently, there was some kind of disturbance in the main lobby around 3:30, but when security responded, they didn't find anything." Diana felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had once preceded enemy contact in hostile territory. What kind of disturbance? Motion sensors triggered in areas where they shouldn't have activated at that time of night. The overnight security guard said he thought he saw movement near the administrative offices, but when he investigated, the area was empty. Carlos pulled up the digital log on his computer screen. "Look at this. The badge access system shows unusual activity patterns over the past week. Multiple attempts to access restricted areas using credentials that shouldn't have those permissions." The information confirmed Diana's worst fears about the surveillance she'd observed and reported. Professional reconnaissance operations typically include attempts to test security systems and identify access vulnerabilities. The fact that someone had been testing badge access suggested they were mapping the hospital's electronic security infrastructure, looking for ways to move through the building without triggering automatic alerts. "Carlos, I need you to call Security Chief Burke immediately," Diana said, her voice carrying an authority that made him look up from the computer screen with surprise. "Tell him we may have hostile individuals conducting active reconnaissance of the cardiac wing." "Hostile individuals? Diana, don't you think that's a little—" "Carlos," Diana's tone stopped him mid-sentence. "3 weeks ago, I documented suspicious surveillance activity in the main lobby. Last week, I reported coordinated movement patterns that suggested professional reconnaissance. Tonight, we have unauthorized access attempts and motion sensor activations in areas that should be secure. This isn't coincidence." Carlos studied her face, recognizing something in her expression that he'd never seen before. The quiet, deferential nurse who'd worked beside him for 3 years had been replaced by someone who spoke with the confidence of experience in situations where being wrong could cost lives. "Okay," he said slowly, "I'll call Burke, but if this turns out to be nothing, I'll apologize for wasting everyone's time. But if I'm right and we don't take precautions, people are going to die." As Carlos reached for the phone, Dr. Brennan's voice cut through the conversation from behind them. "Dr. Brennan, what exactly are you doing?" Diana turned to face the emergency department head, noting automatically that he'd approached from the corridor leading to the administrative offices, the same area where the motion sensors had been triggered. His timing wasn't coincidental. He'd been monitoring our conversation, possibly alerted by the same security system alerts that had concerned Carlos. "Dr. Brennan, we're responding to potential security concerns that may affect patient safety in the cardiac wing," Diana replied, maintaining the professional tone she'd perfected during 3 years of civilian employment. "Security concerns," Brennan's voice carried the dismissive authority of someone who'd never considered that his medical degree might not qualify him to assess all potential threats to hospital operations. "Nurse Kowalski, we've discussed your tendency toward imaginative interpretations of normal hospital activity. These motion sensor alerts are routine maintenance issues, not evidence of some elaborate conspiracy."
Sir, the pattern of alerts combined with the unauthorized access attempts suggests that you've been watching too many action movies during your downtime, Brennan interrupted. Carlos, please disregard Nurse Kowalski's request to contact security. These false alarms waste valuable resources that should be focused on actual patient care. Diana felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed by someone whose expertise didn't extend to the situation they were facing. During her Special Forces career, she'd worked with medical officers who understood the importance of security protocols and threat assessment. Dr. Brennan represented a different type of authority. Academic credentials combined with administrative power, but no practical experience in recognizing or responding to hostile activity. Dr. Brennan, Diana said carefully, my observations are based on specific behavioral indicators that suggest coordinated surveillance and reconnaissance activity. The individuals I documented were conducting systematic observation of hospital security procedures, patient ward layouts, and staff movement patterns. That type of intelligence gathering typically precedes hostile action. Nurse Kowalski, your job is to monitor patient vital signs and administer medications, not to conduct amateur security analysis. Your previous reports about suspicious individuals were investigated by our security department and found to be unfounded. These men were visiting relatives and dealing with the stress of having family members in critical condition.
Sir, with respect, the behavioral patterns I observed were inconsistent with grief or anxiety. These individuals displayed tactical awareness, systematic observation techniques, and coordinated timing that suggested professional training. Brennan's face reddened slightly, a sign that his patience with what he perceived as insubordination was reaching its limit. Nurse Kowalski, I'm going to be very clear about this. Your job responsibilities do not include threat assessment, security analysis, or tactical evaluation of hospital visitors. If you continue to pursue these unfounded security concerns, I'll be forced to recommend disciplinary action that could affect your employment status. The threat hung in the air between them, and Diana recognized the position she'd been placed in. 3 years of carefully maintaining her civilian identity, of avoiding any revelation of her Special Forces background, had led to this moment where her expertise was being dismissed as paranoid fantasy. She could reveal her military training and explain why her threat assessments should be taken seriously, but doing so would end the quiet, anonymous life she'd built at Riverside Medical Center. Understood, sir, Diana replied, her voice steady despite the growing certainty that they were all in danger. Good. Carlos, please return to your normal duties. And Nurse Kowalski, I expect you to focus on patient care rather than security theater for the remainder of your shift. As Dr. Brennan walked away, Carlos looked at Diana with a mixture of confusion and concern. Diana, what was that about? You sounded like you actually know something about security and threat assessment. Diana returned to her medication cart, her mind automatically processing escape routes, defensive positions, and resource availability throughout the cardiac wing. I notice patterns, Carlos, and the pattern here suggests we're being set up for something bad. Set up for what? Before Diana could answer, the lights in the cardiac wing flickered once, then went out completely. Emergency lighting activated immediately, bathing the corridors in the red glow that was supposed to provide illumination during power failures. But Diana knew from her military experience that cutting primary power was often the first step in coordinated assault operations designed to create confusion and disable electronic security systems. In the sudden semi-darkness, she heard Carlos's sharp intake of breath and the confused voices of patients in nearby rooms. But underneath those normal sounds of concern, Diana detected something else, the soft footsteps of multiple individuals moving through the hospital corridors with the disciplined quiet of people who had trained for this exact scenario. Carlos, Diana said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had operated in hostile environments. I need you to get on the emergency communication system and alert all hospital security that we have a Code Silver situation in progress. Code Silver?
Diana, that's for armed intruders. You can't be serious. Diana was already moving toward the medication storage area where she knew bolt cutters were kept for emergency access to secured cabinets. Her special forces training had taught her to improvise weapons from available materials, and a hospital environment provided numerous options for someone who understood how medical equipment could be repurposed for defensive applications. Carlos, Diana said, testing the weight and balance of a pair of surgical scissors that could serve as an improvised weapon if necessary. In approximately 30 seconds, you're going to understand exactly how serious I am. The question is whether you're going to trust me enough to follow my instructions or whether you're going to wait for Dr. Brennan to explain why his medical degree didn't prepare him to recognize a coordinated terrorist attack. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoing from the main hospital corridors answered Carlos's unspoken question about the severity of their situation.
The gunfire lasted exactly 17 seconds, long enough to establish dominance and create panic, but short enough to suggest disciplined operators rather than random violence. Diana counted the shots automatically, her special forces training parsing the information even as her civilian colleagues struggled to process what they were hearing. 3 distinct weapon signatures, coordinated timing, and the controlled bursts that indicated professional military training rather than amateur terrorism. "Jesus Christ," Carlos whispered, his face pale in the emergency lighting. "That's really gunfire, isn't it?" "Affirmative," Diana replied, the military terminology slipping out as her combat instincts overrode 3 years of civilian conditioning. Automatic weapons, probably assault rifles, at least 3 shooters positioned to control the main hospital entrances. The hospital's public address system crackled to life, but instead of Dr. Brennan's voice or a security announcement, they heard something that made Diana's blood run cold. A calm, professionally delivered message in accented English that she recognized as Middle Eastern, possibly Syrian or Lebanese. "Attention staff and patients of Riverside Medical Center. This facility is now under our control. We are not here to harm patients who cooperate with our instructions. We are here to deliver a message about American foreign policy that will be heard around the world. Anyone who attempts to interfere with our operation will be eliminated." Diana was already moving as the announcement continued, her training taking over as she assessed their tactical situation. The cardiac wing's isolation, which had made it attractive for quiet night shifts, now made it a potential trap. Limited exits, concentrated high-value targets in the form of critically ill patients, and minimal security presence created exactly the kind of scenario that terrorist organizations use to maximize psychological impact. "Carlos, I need you to listen very carefully," Diana said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had operated in situations where following instructions meant the difference between life and death. "Get on the emergency communication system and contact Security Chief Burke directly. Tell him we have multiple armed hostiles who have taken control of the hospital. Tell them they're speaking Arabic and appear to be professionally trained." "Diana, how do you know?" "Because I've dealt with similar situations before," she interrupted, pulling open the medication storage cabinet and scanning its contents for anything that could be useful. "Right now, that doesn't matter. What matters is getting accurate information to people who can respond appropriately." Carlos reached for the emergency phone, but before he could dial, they heard footsteps in the corridor. Not the hurried movement of panicked staff, but the measured advance of individuals moving tactically through an environment they had studied and planned for. Diana recognized the sound pattern immediately. 2-person teams, one providing overwatch while the other advanced, standard room-clearing procedures that confirmed her assessment about professional training. "Put the phone down," Diana whispered, grabbing Carlos's arm and pulling him away from the nurse's station. "They're coming this way, and they'll have studied the hospital layout. They know where the communication equipment is located." They moved quickly toward the supply closet at the far end of the corridor, Diana's mind automatically cataloging defensive options and improvised weapons available in a hospital environment. Oxygen tanks could be weaponized if the valve assembly was damaged correctly. Defibrillator units contained high-voltage components that could be dangerous in the right hands.
Even common medical supplies like surgical tubing and metal instruments could be deadly if used by someone with appropriate training. As they reached the supply closet, Diana heard voices speaking in Arabic from the main corridor. Not the emotional shouts of excited amateurs, but the calm, professional communication of operators coordinating a planned assault. She couldn't make out specific words, but the tone and cadence suggested they were reporting successful completion of their initial objectives and preparing to move to the next phase of their operation. "Carlos, Diana, what the hell is happening? Who are these people?" whispered, his face tight with fear. "Professional terrorists," Diana replied, checking the supply closet for anything useful while keeping her voice low enough to avoid detection. Based on their coordination and equipment, probably a cell that's been planning this operation for months. The surveillance I reported was their reconnaissance phase. But why here? Why target a hospital? Diana found what she was looking for, a surgical blade dispenser and a roll of medical tape that could be used to create improvised weapons. Maximum psychological impact with minimal security resistance. Hospitals are soft targets that generate significant media attention, especially when they contain patients who can't be easily evacuated. The voices in the corridor were getting closer, and Diana could now distinguish individual words in Arabic that suggested the team was conducting a systematic search of the cardiac wing. They were looking for something specific, not just establishing control, but seeking particular individuals or information that had brought them to Riverside Medical Center. "Carlos, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly," Diana said, her voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that their next decisions would determine whether they lived or died. "Are there any VIP patients in the cardiac wing? Anyone who might be considered a high-value target for terrorists?"
Carlos thought for a moment. Then his face went pale. Room 318, Ambassador Richardson's wife. She was admitted yesterday for emergency cardiac surgery after a heart attack. The State Department has been coordinating with hospital security about her presence here. Diana felt the pieces clicking into place with the horrible clarity of a well-planned operation coming together exactly as designed. Ambassador Richardson had been instrumental in recent Middle Eastern peace negotiations, and his wife's emergency medical situation had created an opportunity that terrorist organizations would consider irresistible. A soft target, minimal security, maximum symbolic value, and the kind of personal attack that would resonate far beyond the immediate casualties. "That's why they're here," Diana said grimly. "This isn't random terrorism. This is a targeted assassination disguised as a hospital attack." Before Carlos could respond, they heard the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire from the direction of the main nurses' station. Not the controlled bursts they'd heard earlier, but the sustained fire of operators eliminating resistance or destroying equipment. Diana recognized the pattern. They were systematically disabling communication systems and eliminating anyone who might interfere with their primary mission. "Stay here," Diana whispered to Carlos. "Don't move, don't make any noise, and don't try to be a hero. These aren't amateurs you can reason with." "Where are you going?" Diana was already moving toward the supply cabinet, where she knew the hospital kept emergency medical equipment, including items that could be repurposed by someone with her training. "I'm going to do what I should have done 3 years ago when I first spotted their surveillance team." "Diana, you can't take on armed terrorists with medical supplies." She turned to look at him, and Carlos saw something in her eyes that made him realize he'd never really known the woman he'd worked beside for 3 years. The quiet, deferential nurse was gone, replaced by someone whose presence seemed to fill the small supply closet with barely contained violence. "Carlos, for the past 3 years, you've known me as Diana Kowalski, night shift nurse. But before that, I was Staff Sergeant Diana Kowalski, call sign Falcon, Special Forces medical specialist with 8 years of experience in hostile territory." Diana's voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had operated in situations where failure meant death. These terrorists made a critical error in their planning. They assumed this was a soft target with minimal resistance. She opened the medical supply cabinet and began selecting items with the efficiency of someone who had improvised weapons from far less promising materials. They're about to discover that some soft targets bite back.
The sound of Arabic voices was now clearly audible from the main corridor, accompanied by the methodical destruction of communication equipment and the terrified cries of patients who couldn't understand why their safe haven had become a war zone. Diana estimated they had perhaps 2 minutes before the terrorist team reached the supply closet. 2 minutes to prepare for a confrontation that would determine whether Ambassador Richardson's wife became another casualty in an international incident that could destabilize peace negotiations across the Middle East. For 3 years, Diana had successfully hidden from her past, creating a peaceful civilian life dedicated to healing rather than warfare. But some skills, once learned, never really disappear. And sometimes the only way to protect innocent lives is to remember exactly how dangerous you used to be.
Diana's transformation from civilian nurse to special forces operator happened in the space of 30 seconds, her military training reasserting itself with the ruthless efficiency that had kept her alive through 8 years of combat operations. Her breathing steadied, her heart rate decreased despite the adrenaline flooding her system, and her mind began processing the tactical situation with the cold precision that had made Falcon legendary among her special forces peers. "Carlos, listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice dropping to the whisper that carried absolute authority without risking detection. "I'm going to ask you to do things that will seem crazy, but I need you to trust that I know what I'm talking about. Can you do that?" Carlos nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and growing understanding that the woman he'd worked beside for 3 years possessed capabilities he'd never imagined. Diana began methodically selecting items from the medical supply cabinet, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she improvised weapons from materials designed to heal rather than harm. Surgical scalpels became precision throwing weapons when properly weighted with medical tape. Oxygen tubing could serve as garrote wire or restraint material. Even simple syringes filled with appropriate medications could incapacitate opponents if deployed correctly. "First priority," Diana continued, assembling her improvised arsenal while listening to the approaching voices in the corridor. "We need to establish how many hostiles we're dealing with and map their positions throughout the hospital. Based on the gunfire patterns and communication I've heard, I estimate 5 to 7 operators, probably organized in 2-person teams with one individual coordinating overall operations." She pulled out her smartphone and switched it to silent mode, opening the hospital's internal directory that she'd memorized during 3 years of employment. The cardiac wing has 17 patients currently admitted, plus whatever staff members are still in the building. The terrorist's primary target is Ambassador Richardson's wife in room 318, but they'll use the other patients as leverage to prevent security forces from mounting an immediate assault. "Diana, how do you know all this? How can you be sure about their tactics?" "Because I've planned similar operations," Diana replied, the admission carrying the weight of classified missions that never appeared in any official record. Not against hospitals, but against high-value targets in protected environments, where collateral damage had to be minimized. The principles are identical. Establish control, isolate the target area, use civilian shields to prevent counterattack, and create a media spectacle that amplifies the political message. She moved to the supply closet's small window, carefully positioning herself to observe the main corridor without exposing her silhouette to anyone conducting surveillance. Through the emergency lighting, she could see 2 figures moving with tactical precision, their weapon handling and movement patterns confirming her assessment about professional military training. "Second priority," Diana continued, "we need to disable their coordination and communication systems. These operators are relying on radio communication to maintain control over a large facility. If we can disrupt that communication, we can force them to make mistakes or create opportunities for counterattack." Carlos watched in fascination and terror as Diana continued her preparations, transforming common medical supplies into implements of violence with an expertise that spoke to years of specialized training. "Diana, even if you can take out 1 or 2 of them, you can't fight an entire terrorist team with improvised weapons.
I'm not planning to fight them, Diana replied, testing the balance of a scalpel that had been weighted with surgical tape to optimize its aerodynamic properties. I'm planning to hunt them. The distinction carried implications that made Carlos realize he was witnessing the emergence of someone whose skill set had been forged in environments where survival depended on being more dangerous than the people trying to kill you. Diana's calm efficiency, her tactical awareness, and her matter-of-fact discussion of violence suggested capabilities that extended far beyond standard military medical training. Third priority, she continued, we need to identify their weapons and ammunition supply. Professional operators typically carry limited ammunition for mobility purposes, which means they're vulnerable to sustained engagement if we can force them to expend their resources defending multiple positions. Diana opened the supply closet's emergency medical kit and removed several items that most people would consider harmless. Antiseptic solutions that could be used to create temporary blindness, local anesthetics that could be weaponized if injected properly, and even common saline solution that became dangerous if administered incorrectly. Carlos, I need you to access the hospital's security camera system from your smartphone. Most of the cameras will still be operational even with primary power offline, and we need real-time intelligence about terrorist positions and movement patterns. I don't have access to the security system from my phone. Use my credentials, Diana replied, providing him with login information that shouldn't have been available to nursing staff. I've had administrative access for 2 years, ever since I identified vulnerabilities in our emergency response protocols that needed to be addressed.
As Carlos accessed the camera system, Diana continued her tactical assessment, her mind automatically calculating sight lines, choke points, and defensive positions throughout the cardiac wing. The hospital's layout, which she'd memorized during 3 years of employment, now became a battlefield map with clearly defined areas of advantage and vulnerability. I'm in the system, Carlos whispered, his smartphone screen showing feeds from cameras throughout the hospital. Jesus, Diana, there are bodies in the main lobby. Security guards, administrative staff. These people aren't taking prisoners. Diana looked at the smartphone screen, her expression hardening as she confirmed the professionalism and ruthlessness of the terrorist operation. The bodies were positioned in locations that would maximize psychological impact while serving as warnings to anyone who might consider resistance. This was the work of operators who had planned every aspect of their mission with lethal precision. Show me the camera feeds from the cardiac wing, she instructed, studying the terrorist positions with the analytical mind that had made her invaluable during Special Forces reconnaissance missions. The images revealed a coordinated operation that confirmed her worst fears. 2-person teams had established control over key positions throughout the ward, with one individual positioned as overwatch while their partner conducted room-to-room searches. Their equipment was professional-grade military hardware, and their coordination suggested extensive training and rehearsal. Room 318, Diana said grimly, watching as 2 terrorists approached the door where Ambassador Richardson's wife was recovering from cardiac surgery. They're moving toward their primary target. We have to do something, Carlos said desperately. We can't just let them... We're not going to let them do anything, Diana interrupted, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had made similar decisions under fire. But if we move too early or without proper coordination, we'll get everyone in this wing killed. She studied the camera feeds for another 30 seconds, her Special Forces training allowing her to identify weaknesses in the terrorist positions that civilian law enforcement might miss. Their formation was designed to control large areas with minimal personnel, which created gaps that could be exploited by someone with appropriate training and willingness to accept extreme risk. Carlos, in approximately 2 minutes, I'm going to leave the supply closet and begin systematically eliminating the terrorist threat to this hospital. I need you to maintain observation of the security cameras and provide real-time intelligence about their positions and movements. Diana, you can't seriously be planning to take on armed terrorists by yourself. Diana turned to look at him, and Carlos saw in her eyes the same deadly calm that had made Staff Sergeant Diana Kowalski, call sign Falcon, one of the most feared Special Forces operators in her unit.
The quiet nurse who had comforted patients and followed doctors' orders had been replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to radiate controlled violence. Carlos, 3 years ago, I made a decision to stop killing people and start saving them. Tonight, I'm going to discover whether it's possible to do both at the same time. Diana checked her improvised weapons one final time, her movements carrying the mechanical precision of someone who had prepared for similar missions dozens of times. The 17 patients in this wing didn't choose to become part of a terrorist operation. Ambassador Richardson's wife didn't choose to become a target because of her diplomatic work. And I didn't choose to have my peaceful civilian life disrupted by people who think hospitals are acceptable battlegrounds. But sometimes you don't get to choose the situation you find yourself in. Sometimes you only get to choose how you respond to it. The sound of automatic weapons fire from the direction of room 318 made the choice for her.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Diana moved from the supply closet with the fluid silence of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of moving undetected through hostile territory. The emergency lighting cast long shadows throughout the cardiac wing, creating a landscape of concealment and danger that she navigated with the confidence of someone whose life had once depended on such skills. The gunfire from room 318 had lasted only 3 seconds, not the sustained fire of execution, but the controlled bursts of operators eliminating resistance or destroying equipment. Diana's Special Forces experience told her that Ambassador Richardson's wife was likely still alive. The terrorists would want to use her as leverage rather than eliminate their primary asset immediately. "Carlos," she whispered into the Bluetooth earpiece she'd improvised from her smartphone, "I need continuous updates on terrorist positions from the security cameras. Call out any movement changes immediately." "Diana, are you sure about this? There are at least 5 armed men between you and room 318. "That's why I'm going to eliminate them one at a time, instead of trying to fight them all simultaneously," she replied, pressing herself against the corridor wall as she approached the first intersection. Military Tactics 101. Never accept a fair fight if you can avoid it. The first terrorist was exactly where Diana had predicted he would be, positioned at the junction between the cardiac wing and the main hospital corridor, providing overwatch for his partner who was conducting room searches. He was young, probably mid-20s, with the kind of focused intensity that came from extensive training and absolute commitment to his mission. His weapon handling was professional, his positioning was tactically sound, and his attention was focused entirely on potential threats from the main hospital areas. What he wasn't watching for was a hospital nurse who had spent 8 years learning how to kill people quietly and efficiently. Diana had 3 ways to neutralize the target. The weighted scalpel she'd prepared could sever his carotid artery if thrown with sufficient precision. The improvised garrote made from oxygen tubing could render him unconscious in less than 10 seconds. Or she could use the syringe filled with concentrated sedative to incapacitate him chemically. Each approach carried different risks and advantages, and her choice would depend on the specific tactical situation she encountered. She chose the syringe. Moving with the predatory silence that had made Falcon legendary among Special Forces operators, Diana approached the terrorist from his blind spot, using the emergency lighting and corridor angles to remain invisible until she was within striking distance. The attack lasted less than 4 seconds, a precise injection to the neck that delivered enough sedative to drop a man twice his size, combined with a chokehold that prevented him from crying out as the medication took effect. The terrorist collapsed silently, his weapon secured before he hit the floor. Diana quickly checked his equipment, finding what she'd expected: professional military hardware, including an HK-416 assault rifle, spare magazines, tactical communication gear, and identification documents that suggested Syrian origin, but were probably fabricated. "Target 1 neutralized," she whispered to Carlos. "No alert to the other terrorists. What's the status on room 318? 2 men still inside.
Carlos replied, his voice tight with amazement at what he just witnessed through the security cameras. They appeared to be setting up some kind of equipment, possibly explosives or recording gear. Diana appropriated the terrorists' communication headset, listening to the Arabic chatter that confirmed her assessment about their coordination and professionalism. They were reporting successful completion of Phase 1 objectives and preparing to initiate what they called the demonstration phase, terminology that suggested they were planning to broadcast their message using Ambassador Richardson's wife as a prop. Carlos, I need you to contact Security Chief Burke and tell him we have professional terrorists using high-grade military equipment. Tell them they're planning some kind of broadcast demonstration, probably involving the execution of high-value targets. Diana, how did you... Jesus, that was incredible. You took that guy down like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing, Diana replied, checking the terrorist's assault rifle and finding it properly maintained and fully loaded. It was 8 years of training that I hoped I'd never have to use again. Now give me positions on the remaining targets. She moved toward the next intersection, her improved equipment making her significantly more dangerous, but also creating new tactical considerations. The assault rifle provided superior firepower and range, but it was also louder and more conspicuous than her improvised weapons. Using it would alert all remaining terrorists to her presence, eliminating the element of surprise that had made her first neutralization possible. The second terrorist was positioned near the nurses' station, apparently tasked with monitoring the hospital's communication systems and ensuring that no alerts were transmitted to outside authorities. He was older than his partner, possibly in his 30s, with the kind of situational awareness that suggested combat experience rather than just training. This one would be more challenging.
Diana studied his position through the scope of the appropriated rifle, noting his fields of fire, cover options, and reaction distances. He'd chosen his location well: good visibility down multiple corridors, solid cover behind the nurse's station counter, and multiple escape routes if his position became compromised. Taking him down with stealth would require approaching from an angle he couldn't monitor, probably through one of the patient rooms that provided access to the nurse's station from an unexpected direction. Carlos, I need you to create a distraction, something that will draw his attention toward the main hospital entrance for approximately 15 seconds. What kind of distraction? Trigger the fire alarm system in the administrative wing. He'll assume it's either emergency responders attempting entry or one of his team members encountering problems. Either way, he'll need to investigate or report the situation to his coordinator. Diana positioned herself in room 315, whose elderly occupant was unconscious and connected to monitors that would alert the nurse's station if his condition changed. The room's configuration provided an approach vector to the terrorist's position that would be invisible until she was within striking distance. Fire alarm activated, Carlos reported. He's definitely reacting. Looks like he's trying to establish radio contact with someone. Through the room's partially open door, Diana could see the terrorist speaking urgently into his communication gear while scanning the corridors for threats. His attention was divided between multiple priorities, creating exactly the kind of tactical vulnerability that Special Forces training had taught her to exploit. She moved. The second neutralization was more complex than the first, requiring her to cross an open area where she would be visible for approximately 3 seconds before reaching effective range. The terrorist detected her movement and was beginning to raise his weapon when Diana's assault rifle fired twice, controlled pairs to center mass, that dropped him immediately without giving him time to alert his partners. The sound of gunfire would travel throughout the cardiac wing, eliminating any remaining element of surprise, but also announcing to the remaining terrorists that they were facing organized resistance rather than helpless civilians. Diana appropriated the second terrorist's equipment, including additional ammunition, and what appeared to be a tablet computer containing floor plans of the hospital and detailed information about high-value targets. Carlos, the remaining terrorists now know they're under attack. They'll be changing their tactics and possibly accelerating their timeline for whatever demonstration they're planning. Diana, there's movement in room 318. It looks like they're positioning the ambassador's wife in front of some kind of camera equipment. Diana felt the familiar ice-cold rage that had sustained her through the most dangerous missions of her Special Forces career.
These weren't soldiers fighting for a cause they believed in. They were terrorists using an innocent woman's medical emergency as an opportunity to create propaganda that would be broadcast around the world. The personal nature of the attack, targeting someone's wife and grandmother for political purposes, violated every principle of honorable warfare that Diana had learned during her military service. "Not on my watch," she said quietly, checking her weapons and preparing to assault the remaining terrorist positions. "Carlos, I want you to call 911 and tell them we have an active shooter situation at Riverside Medical Center. Tell them we need tactical units and medical personnel, but warn them that the terrorists have professional military equipment and training." "What about you?" Diana was already moving toward room 318, her approach planned to provide maximum tactical advantage while minimizing risk to the ambassador's wife and other patients in the immediate area. The quiet nurse who had spent 3 years trying to forget her capacity for violence was gone, replaced by Staff Sergeant Diana Kowalski, call sign Falcon, whose mission was now simple and absolute: eliminate the terrorist threat and protect innocent lives by any means necessary. "I'm going to end this," she said, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had never failed when lives depended on her actions. One way or another, these terrorists picked the wrong hospital and the wrong nurse for their demonstration.
The remaining 3 terrorists had reacted to the loss of their team members with the professional adaptability that Diana had expected from operators with their level of training. Through the appropriated communication headset, she could hear rapid Arabic exchanges that indicated they were implementing contingency plans and preparing for sustained combat against an unknown adversary. "Carlos, what's the status on room 318? Diana asked, positioning herself in the medication room adjacent to the target area where she could observe terrorist movements without exposing herself to direct fire. "They've barricaded the door and positioned the ambassador's wife in front of what looks like a video camera," Carlos reported, his voice tight with stress as he monitored multiple security feeds simultaneously. "One of them is speaking into what appears to be a satellite phone, probably coordinating with someone outside the hospital." Diana processed this information through the tactical framework she'd developed during years of Special Forces operations. The terrorists were transitioning from assault phase to consolidation phase, preparing to use their high-value hostage as leverage while broadcasting their political message to maximum effect. The satellite phone suggested coordination with a larger organization that would distribute the resulting propaganda footage across international media networks. "Time factor is now critical," Diana said, checking her appropriated weapons and calculating approach vectors to room 318. "Once they begin broadcasting, they'll have no incentive to keep the ambassador's wife alive. We need to neutralize them before they complete their media setup." Through the communication headset, she heard one of the terrorists reporting in Arabic that they had encountered unexpected resistance and lost contact with 2 team members. The response from their coordinator was immediate and decisive: complete the primary mission immediately, eliminate all witnesses, and prepare for extraction within 15 minutes. Diana's Special Forces experience told her exactly what that timeline meant: a coordinated escape plan that probably involved external support, transportation, and safe house arrangements. These weren't suicide terrorists planning to die for their cause. They were professional operators who intended to complete their mission and escape to conduct similar operations in the future. "Not happening," Diana muttered, beginning her approach to room 318, using a route that would minimize her exposure to defensive fire while maximizing her tactical options. The third terrorist had positioned himself in room 316, using the elderly patient's room as an observation post that provided overwatch for his partners in room 318. Diana could see him through the partially open door, his assault rifle trained on the corridor approach that any conventional assault would require. He was young but disciplined, maintaining his position despite the obvious stress of losing team members to an unknown threat. Diana's approach came from less than 6 feet away, close enough that the terrorist had no opportunity to raise his weapon or call for assistance. The combat knife she'd appropriated from the second terrorist slid between his ribs with surgical precision, targeting the heart with the same anatomical knowledge she'd once used to save lives. He collapsed silently, his weapon secured before it could clatter to the floor. "Target 3 neutralized," Diana reported to Carlos. 2 hostiles remaining in room 318 with the primary target. "Diana, I'm seeing movement in the corridor outside the cardiac wing. It looks like hospital security is finally responding, but they're moving like they have no idea what they're dealing with." Through the appropriated communication gear, she could hear the remaining terrorists coordinating their final phase.
They had detected the approach of security personnel and were preparing to execute the ambassador's wife on camera as their concluding message before attempting to escape through what they believed was their predetermined extraction route. Carlos, get on the emergency communication system and warn Security Chief Burke that he's dealing with professional military operators, not amateur terrorists. Tell them they have assault rifles, tactical training, and escape plans that probably involve external support. Diana positioned herself outside room 318, studying the door configuration and wall construction to determine the best approach for a dynamic entry that would neutralize both terrorists while protecting the ambassador's wife. The room contained critical medical equipment that couldn't be damaged without potentially killing the patient, and the terrorists' positioning suggested they were using her as a human shield while maintaining overwatch on the room's primary entrance. Target is positioned between the hostiles and the camera equipment. They're forcing her to read from some kind of prepared statement while they film. Diana, if you don't move soon, they're going to kill her on camera.
Diana could hear muffled voices from inside room 318, the ambassador's wife speaking in the halting tone of someone reading under extreme duress, interrupted by harsh Arabic commands from her captors. The sound crystallized everything that Diana had been feeling since the attack began. Rage at terrorists who would exploit an elderly woman's medical emergency for propaganda purposes, frustration at 3 years of having her expertise dismissed by civilian authorities, and the deadly calm that came from knowing she possessed the skills necessary to end the situation permanently. Carlos, in 30 seconds, I'm going to breach room 318. I need you to trigger the fire suppression system for that room only. The halon gas will create momentary confusion and visual obstruction that will give me tactical advantage. The fire suppression system could affect the ambassador's wife's medical condition. The bullets they're about to put in her head will affect it more, Diana replied, positioning herself for dynamic entry while checking her weapons one final time. Trust me, Carlos, I've done this before. She could hear through the door that the terrorists were concluding their propaganda statement and preparing for what they undoubtedly intended to be the execution phase of their operation. One of them was speaking into the satellite phone, probably confirming that the footage was being transmitted successfully to their coordination network. Fire suppression activated, Carlos announced. Diana heard the distinctive hiss of halon gas flooding room 318, followed by surprised shouts in Arabic as the terrorists realized their controlled environment was being compromised. The gas would create momentary disorientation and visual obstruction, exactly the tactical advantage she needed for what Special Forces doctrine called a surgical entry designed to neutralize multiple hostiles in a confined space while protecting friendly casualties. She breached the door with the explosive force that had made her legendary during her military career, her assault rifle already trained on the first terrorist's center mass as she rolled through the entry point and acquired targets with the reflexive precision of someone who had performed similar operations dozens of times. The fourth terrorist died before he could comprehend that the door had been breached. The fifth terrorist had time to register Diana's presence and begin raising his weapon, but his reaction speed was insufficient against someone whose reflexes had been honed by years of combat operations, where being second fastest meant being dead. 2 controlled pairs to center mass and room 318 was secure. Diana immediately moved to check the ambassador's wife, her medical training taking over as she assessed the elderly woman's condition while securing the room against potential additional threats. The woman was conscious but in shock, her cardiac monitor showing elevated heart rate and blood pressure that indicated dangerous stress levels but no immediate life-threatening complications. "Ma'am, I'm Diana. I'm a nurse here at the hospital," she said in the calm, reassuring tone she'd perfected during 3 years of patient care. "You're safe now. The people who were threatening you are dead, and medical assistance is on the way." The ambassador's wife looked at Diana with eyes that reflected both terror and growing comprehension that her ordeal was over. Are you really a nurse?" she asked weakly. Diana looked down at her blood-splattered scrubs, the assault rifle still in her hands, and the tactical gear she'd appropriated from dead terrorists. "Yes, ma'am, I'm a nurse. I just used to be other things, too."
The silence that followed the elimination of the terrorist threat lasted exactly 47 seconds, long enough for Diana to complete her medical assessment of Ambassador Richardson's wife and ensure that room 318 was secure, but not long enough to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The quiet nurse who had spent 3 years avoiding attention had just single-handedly neutralized a professional terrorist cell, and there was no way to conceal that reality from the authorities who were about to flood Riverside Medical Center. "Carlos!" Carlos's voice came through her earpiece, tight with amazement and concern. "Hospital security and SWAT teams are entering the building. They're going to find you standing over 5 dead bodies with military weapons. How do you want to handle this?" Before Diana could respond, she heard the distinctive sound of tactical boots moving rapidly through the hospital corridors. The coordinated advance of professional law enforcement units who had been briefed to expect armed terrorists and were prepared to eliminate any threats they encountered. In approximately 2 minutes, they would breach room 318, expecting to find hostages and terrorists, only to discover a nurse in blood-splattered scrubs holding an assault rifle over bodies that showed clear evidence of professional-level combat skills. "Carlos, I need you to contact Security Chief Burke immediately and tell him that the terrorist threat has been neutralized by hospital staff," Diana said, quickly securing the weapons she'd appropriated and positioning herself to appear as non-threatening as possible when law enforcement arrived. "Tell him that Staff Sergeant Diana Kowalski, formerly of Special Forces, eliminated 5 hostiles and secured the high-value target." "Diana, they're going to want explanations that you can't give without revealing classified information about your military background." "I know," Diana replied, checking the ambassador's wife's vital signs one final time before the room was overrun by tactical units who would take control of the scene. 3 years of hiding are about to end, but 17 patients are alive because of it. The first SWAT officer through the door moved with the tactical precision that Diana recognized from her own military training. His weapon trained on her until he could assess whether she represented a threat or a casualty. Behind him, additional officers flowed into the room with the coordinated efficiency of a unit that had trained extensively for hostage rescue operations. "Drop your weapons and get on the ground," the lead officer commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone prepared to use lethal force if his instructions weren't followed immediately. "I'm Diana Kowalski, registered nurse employed by this hospital. I neutralized the terrorist threat and secured the high-value target. Ambassador Richardson's wife is stable but requires immediate medical attention for stress-related cardiac complications." As if summoned by her words, Dr. Brennan appeared in the doorway, his face pale with shock as he took in the scene: 5 dead terrorists, military weapons scattered around the room, and the quiet night nurse he had dismissed as paranoid, standing over the carnage like some kind of avenging angel. "Jesus Christ! What happened here?" Brennan asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he struggled to process the transformation of his understanding about Diana's capabilities. "Dr. Brennan," Diana said, her tone carrying none of the deference he had grown accustomed to during their previous interactions, "Mrs. Richardson requires immediate medical evaluation for stress-related cardiac complications. Her monitors indicate elevated heart rate and blood pressure that could precipitate additional cardiac events if not addressed promptly." Brennan moved toward the ambassador's wife with the automatic response of a physician confronted with medical emergency, but his eyes kept returning to Diana as if she were some kind of optical illusion that his brain couldn't properly process. "Nurse Kowalski, how did you... What exactly..." He gestured helplessly at the dead terrorists and military equipment surrounding them. "I did my job, sir," Diana replied. "I protected patients under my care from hostile action using whatever skills were necessary to ensure their survival."
Security Chief Burke arrived with a team of hospital administrators and federal agents whose presence indicated that word of the terrorist attack had already reached the highest levels of government. Burke was a former police officer who had transitioned to private security, and his expression suggested he understood the implications of what had occurred far better than the medical staff. Ms. Kowalski, Burke said, approaching with the careful respect of someone who recognized the aftermath of professional combat operations. I received some very interesting reports about your background and actions tonight. Would you be willing to provide a detailed briefing about what occurred here? Of course, Diana said, but first I need to ensure that all patients in the cardiac wing receive medical evaluation for trauma-related complications, and I need confirmation that no additional terrorist threats exist elsewhere in the hospital. One of the federal agents, a woman in her 40s, whose bearing suggested extensive law enforcement experience, stepped forward with obvious interest. Ms. Kowalski, I'm Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI Counterterrorism Division. Our preliminary assessment indicates that you single-handedly neutralized a professional terrorist cell using improvised weapons and appropriated equipment. That suggests training and experience that extends significantly beyond standard nursing qualifications. Diana looked around the room at the assembled officials, medical staff, and law enforcement officers, all of whom were staring at her with expressions ranging from amazement to suspicion. The quiet, invisible nurse who had spent 3 years avoiding attention was gone forever, replaced by someone whose actions had saved lives, but also raised questions that would require answers she had hoped never to provide. Agent Martinez, Diana said quietly, my background includes 8 years of military service in specialized roles that are still classified. Tonight, I use that training to protect patients and neutralize threats to this hospital. I'm prepared to provide whatever information is necessary to complete your investigation, but my primary concern remains the medical welfare of the patients who were traumatized by this attack. Dr. Brennan was staring at her with an expression that combined embarrassment, amazement, and growing comprehension of exactly how badly he had misjudged the woman he'd dismissed as an overly imaginative nurse with security delusions. Diana, he said slowly, when you tried to warn me about suspicious individuals conducting surveillance, you weren't being paranoid, were you? No, sir. I was conducting threat assessment based on behavioral indicators that I learned to recognize during military service in hostile environments. The individuals I reported were conducting reconnaissance for tonight's operation. The ambassador's wife, who had been silent during the official discussions, suddenly spoke up from her hospital bed. This woman saved my life, she said, her voice carrying the strength of someone who had survived an ordeal that would have broken most people. Agent Martinez looked at Diana with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand that the quiet nurse represented something unprecedented in her experience with counterterrorism operations. Ms. Kowalski, we're going to need extensive debriefings about your background, your assessment of tonight's terrorist operation, and your recommendations for preventing similar attacks in the future. But first, I want to say that your actions tonight saved lives and prevented what could have been an international incident with significant political ramifications. Diana nodded, accepting the praise with the same calm professionalism she demonstrated throughout the crisis. But inside, she was processing the reality that her carefully constructed civilian life was over, replaced by something she couldn't yet fully comprehend or control.
The media circus began at dawn, with news vans lining the streets around Riverside Medical Center, and reporters broadcasting live updates about the nurse who took down 5 terrorists. Diana watched the coverage from the hospital's administrative conference room, where she'd been sequestered for debriefings with federal agents, military intelligence officers, and counterterrorism specialists who seemed equally fascinated by her story and concerned about the security implications of her revealed identity. Ms. Kowalski, we've confirmed your military service record and Special Forces classification, Agent Martinez said, reviewing a FIC file that had apparently materialized overnight. Staff Sergeant Diana Kowalski, call sign Falcon, 8 years active duty including 3 combat tours and participation in classified operations across multiple theaters. Your commanding officers describe you as one of the most effective Special Forces medics they ever worked with. Diana sipped coffee from a hospital mug that seemed absurdly normal given the circumstances, watching through the conference room window as FBI crime scene technicians processed evidence from the cardiac wing. Agent Martinez, I left that life behind 3 years ago because I wanted to save lives rather than take them. Last night was necessary, but it wasn't something I wanted to return to.
According to your former team leader, Colonel Rachel Cross, you requested discharge after becoming emotionally exhausted by the demands of Special Forces operations, Martinez continued. She also mentioned that you chose nursing specifically because you wanted to use your medical training in a healing capacity rather than a combat role. That's correct, Diana said quietly. I found genuine satisfaction in patient care, in helping people recover from illness and injury without the moral complexity of military operations. Dr. Brennan entered the conference room with an expression that combined professional respect, personal embarrassment, and obvious curiosity about the woman he'd worked beside for 3 years without really knowing. Behind him walked Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the hospital's chief of staff, who had hired Diana based on her exceptional clinical performance and mysterious but impeccable references. Diana, Dr. Santos said, settling into a chair across from her, I owe you an apology. When I hired you 3 years ago, I suspected your background included more military medical experience than appeared in your official transcripts, but I never imagined this. She gestured toward the television screen, showing footage of the tactical operations aftermath. Dr. Santos, you gave me exactly what I needed. An opportunity to use my medical skills in a healing environment where past experience didn't define present responsibilities. I'm grateful for that chance, even though circumstances have now made it impossible to maintain. Dr. Brennan cleared his throat uncomfortably. Diana, I need to address my behavior during the crisis. When you tried to warn me about security threats, I dismissed your concerns as paranoid delusions. I ordered you to focus on patient care rather than security analysis. I threatened disciplinary action if you continued pursuing what I called unfounded security theater. Dr. Brennan, you responded based on the information available to you. You had no reason to suspect that your night shift nurse possessed specialized training in threat assessment and counterterrorism operations. But I should have listened. Your observations were accurate, your threat assessments were professional, and your recommendations could have prevented the entire crisis if I had taken them seriously. Instead, I let my academic arrogance override practical expertise that could have saved lives. Agent Martinez looked up from her files with obvious interest. Ms. Kowalski, can you walk us through the intelligence indicators you identified during the terrorists' reconnaissance phase? We're trying to understand how they planned this operation and whether similar threats might exist at other medical facilities. Diana spent the next hour providing detailed analysis of the surveillance patterns she'd observed, the behavioral indicators that had suggested hostile intent, and the tactical vulnerabilities that had made Riverside Medical Center an attractive target for terrorist operations. Her assessment was thorough, professional, and delivered with the analytical precision that had made her invaluable during Special Forces intelligence operations. Remarkable, said Colonel James Harrison, a Pentagon liaison who had arrived to coordinate military aspects of the investigation. Your threat assessment was more accurate than intelligence reports from agencies with billion-dollar budgets and thousands of analysts. You identified, tracked, and predicted a terrorist cell's operational planning using nothing but observational skills and experience. Colonel, pattern recognition and threat assessment were core components of my Special Forces training. Those skills don't disappear just because you change careers. Dr. Santos leaned forward with obvious curiosity. Diana, why didn't you ever mention your military background? Your experience would have been valuable in developing hospital security protocols and emergency response procedures. Because I wanted to be judged on my nursing capabilities rather than my military service. I chose civilian healthcare specifically to escape the violence and moral complexity of Special Forces operations. Revealing my background would have made that transition impossible.
Carlos appeared in the conference room doorway, still wearing scrubs from the previous night's shift, and looking like he hadn't slept since the crisis began. Diana, I wanted to check on you before the media mob figures out where you are, he said. then noticed the assembled officials and federal agents. "Sorry, I didn't realize you were in a meeting." "Carlos, please come in," Diana said, grateful for a familiar face among the government officials and hospital administrators who had taken control of her day. "Agent Martinez, this is Carlos Mendez, the nurse who provided critical intelligence support during the terrorist operation." Agent Martinez looked at Carlos with interest. "Mr. Mendez, we'd like to debrief you about your role in last night's events. Your security camera coordination and communication support were apparently essential to Ms. Kowalski's successful counterterrorism operation." Carlos looked at Diana with an expression that combined amazement, respect, and continuing disbelief about the transformation he'd witnessed. "Diana, when I saw you take down that first terrorist, I knew you weren't just a nurse, but I had no idea. Special forces? 8 years of combat operations? How did you hide something like that?" "By being very good at my civilian job and very careful about maintaining professional boundaries. For 3 years, I was exactly what I appeared to be, a dedicated night shift nurse who took excellent care of her patients and avoided drawing attention to herself." "But you were also watching," Carlos said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. "Every shift, every day, you were conducting security assessments and threat analysis without anyone realizing it." "It's impossible to turn off training like that," Diana admitted. "I noticed things, documented patterns, and filed reports when I identified potential threats. But I never expected to need those skills in a civilian environment." Dr. Brennan looked at Diana with an expression that suggested he was still processing the magnitude of his misjudgment. "Diana, the hospital administration is prepared to offer you whatever position would best utilize your unique combination of medical expertise and security capabilities. We obviously can't return to the previous arrangement where your background remains concealed." "Dr. Brennan, I appreciate the offer, but I need time to consider what my future looks like now that my military service is public knowledge. 3 years ago, I thought I was leaving Special Forces permanently. Last night, I discovered that some aspects of your identity never really change, regardless of the circumstances you find yourself in." Agent Martinez closed her files and looked at Diana with obvious respect. "Ms. Kowalski, the federal government would be very interested in discussing consulting opportunities that would utilize your expertise in protecting similar soft targets from terrorist threats. Your successful counter-operation last night represents exactly the kind of capability we need to prevent future attacks." Diana looked around the conference room at the faces of people who now saw her completely differently than they had 24 hours earlier. The quiet, invisible nurse was gone forever, replaced by someone whose actions had saved lives, but also attracted attention that would make returning to her previous anonymous existence impossible. 2 weeks after what the media had dubbed the Riverside incident, Diana found herself standing in the same cardiac wing where she'd spent 3 years as an anonymous night nurse. But everything had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The patients were different, the security presence was significantly enhanced, and her colleagues looked at her with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and occasional uncertainty about how to interact with someone whose capabilities extended far beyond traditional nursing qualifications. "Diana, room 314 is asking for you, specifically," said Dr. Nina Patel, a young resident who had joined the cardiac wing staff during Diana's forced administrative leave. "Mr. Chen says he won't discuss his discharge planning with anyone else because Nurse Kowalski is the only one who understands what it means to protect people." Diana smiled as she reviewed Mr. Chen's chart, noting the post-surgical recovery progress that indicated he would be ready for discharge within 48 hours. "Dr. Patel, Mr. Chen is a retired Army sergeant who served 2 tours in Vietnam. He's responding to recognition of shared military experience, not any specific medical expertise on my part." "But you do have specific medical expertise that goes beyond nursing school," Dr. Patel said with obvious curiosity. "The staff has been talking about your background, and some of the older physicians remember cases where your clinical insights exceeded what would be expected from someone with traditional training." It was true, Diana realized, looking back on 3 years of patient interactions where she'd occasionally provided medical analysis that reflected her special forces training rather than civilian nursing education.
Combat medicine had taught her to recognize trauma patterns, assess critical injuries, and make treatment decisions under extreme pressure, skills that had unconsciously influenced her civilian practice in ways she hadn't fully acknowledged. Dr. Patel, military medical training emphasizes rapid assessment and decisive intervention. Those skills translate well to civilian emergency medicine, but they're not necessarily appropriate for all patient care situations. Which is why the hospital administration's offer makes so much sense. You could continue providing direct patient care while also developing security protocols and emergency response procedures that could save lives in crisis situations. The offer Dr. Brennan had presented was unprecedented in Diana's experience, a newly created position as Clinical Operations Security Specialist, reporting jointly to the medical staff and hospital administration. Her responsibilities would include traditional nursing duties, supplemented by threat assessment, emergency planning, and staff training in crisis response procedures. The position recognizes that your unique combination of medical expertise and security capabilities represents an asset that shouldn't be wasted, Dr. Santos had explained during their formal discussion. We're not asking you to return to military operations, but we are asking you to help us protect the patients and staff who depend on this institution. But Diana had also received other offers that complicated her decision-making process. Agent Martinez had presented detailed proposals for federal consulting work that would utilize her counterterrorism experience to protect medical facilities across the country. Colonel Harrison had suggested military contractor positions that would provide security analysis for overseas medical missions. Even private security companies had approached her with lucrative opportunities that would capitalize on her newfound reputation as someone who could neutralize professional terrorist threats. The question isn't whether people want to hire me. The question is whether any of these opportunities allow me to maintain the balance between healing and protecting that made me choose nursing in the first place. Carlos had been one of the few people who treated her the same way after the incident as he had before, perhaps because he'd witnessed her transformation firsthand and understood that her essential character hadn't changed despite the revealed capabilities. Diana, what do you want to do? Not what you think you should do or what other people expect, but what would make you feel like you're using your skills in the right way. Before Diana could answer, Security Chief Burke approached with the kind of serious expression that suggested important news rather than routine updates. Diana, I wanted to inform you that we've completed the investigation into the terrorist cell's planning and coordination. The intelligence you provided was instrumental in identifying their support network and preventing similar attacks at other medical facilities. Any additional threats we should be concerned about? Diana asked, automatically shifting into the analytical mode that had become second nature during her Special Forces career. Nothing immediate, but the FBI has identified this attack as part of a larger pattern of operations targeting soft infrastructure in civilian environments. Hospitals, schools, transportation hubs, anywhere that combines high symbolic value with limited security capabilities. The information confirmed Diana's growing understanding that her revelation during the Riverside incident had occurred at a time when her specific skill set was becoming increasingly valuable for protecting civilian populations from sophisticated terrorist threats. The line between military and civilian security was blurring in ways that made her background relevant to challenges that extended far beyond traditional combat operations.
Burke, what's your professional assessment of the security improvements we've implemented since the attack? Diana asked. Significant enhancement of physical security measures and staff training protocols, Burke replied. But the most important improvement is having someone on staff who can recognize and assess threats before they become operational. Your threat identification capabilities are worth more than all the cameras and sensors we've installed. Dr. Brennan approached their group with the deferential manner he'd adopted since acknowledging his failure to take Diana's pre-attack warnings seriously. Diana, I wanted to update you on the hospital board's final decision regarding your employment status and future responsibilities. Diana felt the familiar tension that preceded important decisions, the same anticipation she'd experienced before mission briefings that would determine whether her Special Forces team would be deployed into hostile territory. Dr. Brennan, what's the board's recommendation? The board unanimously approved the Clinical Operations Security Specialist position with full nursing responsibilities plus security consultation duties, Brennan said. They also approved a significant salary increase that reflects the unique value of your combined expertise. And if I decline the offer? Then you remain employed as a registered nurse with the same responsibilities you've always had, but with the understanding that your security expertise will be available for consultation when situations require it. The board recognizes that you chose nursing for specific reasons, and they don't want to force you into a role that conflicts with those motivations. Diana looked around the cardiac wing where she'd found peace during 3 years of civilian life, noting the patients who depended on her medical expertise and the colleagues who had come to respect both aspects of her professional identity. She thought about the federal offers that would take her back into the world of counterterrorism operations and the private sector opportunities that would capitalize on her combat experience. But most importantly, she thought about the 17 patients who had survived the terrorist attack because she'd been in the right place, at the right time, with the right combination of skills to protect them. Dr. Brennan, I accept the clinical operations security specialist position, Diana said quietly, but I have one condition. What's that? My primary responsibility remains patient care. The security consultation and threat assessment work supplements my nursing duties, but never replaces them. I'm a nurse who happens to have special forces training, not a security consultant who also does medical work. Dr. Brennan smiled with obvious relief. Agreed. The hospital needs both aspects of your expertise, but we understand which one defines your professional identity. As they concluded the discussion, Diana realized that she'd found a way to honor both the healer and the warrior without sacrificing either aspect of her identity. She would continue providing direct patient care while also using her military experience to protect the people and institution she'd grown to care about during 3 years of civilian service. The quiet nurse who had tried to disappear was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the greatest service you can provide is refusing to hide your capabilities when others need them most.
6 months after the Riverside incident, Diana stood in the same cardiac wing where her anonymous civilian life had ended, and her integrated professional identity had begun. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated a ward that had been transformed by lessons learned from the terrorist attack. Enhanced security protocols, improved emergency communication systems, and staff training programs that had become a model for medical facilities across the country. Nurse Kowalski, I've completed the security assessment checklist for the morning shift, said Airman First Class Jessica Martinez, a young veteran who had specifically requested assignment to Riverside Medical Center after learning about Diana's story through military networks. All access points secured, communication systems operational, and no unusual activity detected during the overnight hours. Diana reviewed the assessment with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd once applied to cargo manifests and Special Forces mission planning. The security protocols they'd implemented weren't just administrative requirements, but practical measures developed from hard-won experience about how professional terrorists planned and executed operations against soft civilian targets. Outstanding work, Martinez, Diana said, noting the thoroughness of the documentation and the professional competence that reflected military training adapted to civilian healthcare environments. What's your impression of the new emergency response procedures we tested last week? Significant improvement in coordination between medical staff and security personnel, Martinez replied. The communication protocols you developed allow us to share critical information without compromising patient care or operational security. The training programs Diana had developed represented a synthesis of everything she'd learned during 8 years of Special Forces operations and 3 years of civilian nursing. Healthcare workers learned to recognize threat indicators and respond appropriately to security emergencies, while security personnel received medical training that helped them understand the complexities of protecting patients who couldn't be easily evacuated during crisis situations. Martinez, you've been here for 3 months now.
What's your assessment of how military experience translates to civilian healthcare work? The young airman considered the question carefully before responding. Ma'am, the core mission is different. Healing instead of engaging enemy forces, but the fundamental principles are identical. Attention to detail, professional competence, and willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for mission success. The biggest difference is that success is measured in lives saved rather than threats eliminated. Diana smiled at the response, recognizing in Martinez the same search for meaningful purpose that had driven her own transition from military to civilian service. That's exactly right. The skills are transferable, but the application requires understanding that our primary mission is always healing. Dr. Patel approached with a tablet containing patient updates and the kind of comfortable familiarity that had developed between medical staff who had learned to appreciate Diana's unique combination of clinical expertise and security awareness. Diana, Mr. Thompson in room 316 is asking about the new safety procedures. He's a former police officer who's curious about the protocols you've implemented. I'll speak with him during rounds. Former law enforcement and military personnel often appreciate understanding how we've enhanced security without compromising the healing environment they need for recovery. The integration had taken months to achieve, but Diana had finally found the balance she'd been seeking between her medical responsibilities and her security capabilities. Patients received the same level of clinical care they'd always expected, but the institution now possessed the threat awareness and response capabilities that could prevent future tragedies. Diana, Carlos called from the nurses' station. You have visitors in the administrative conference room. Dr. Santos said it was important. Diana made her way to the conference room, where she found Agent Martinez and Colonel Harrison waiting with expressions that suggested significant news rather than routine updates about ongoing investigations. Ms. Kowalski, we wanted to inform you that the security protocols and training programs you've developed at Riverside Medical Center are being implemented at medical facilities across the country. The Department of Homeland Security has designated your model as the standard for protecting healthcare infrastructure from terrorist threats. Furthermore, Colonel Harrison added, the Pentagon has approved a consulting contract that would allow you to maintain your current position while providing security analysis for military medical facilities overseas. Your expertise in integrating medical operations with force protection measures addresses critical vulnerabilities that traditional approaches have failed to solve. Diana processed the information with the same analytical precision she'd applied to threat assessments and patient care decisions. The offers represented recognition that her unique combination of skills addressed security challenges that extended far beyond Riverside Medical Center, but they also carried implications that could fundamentally change her carefully constructed civilian life. Agent Martinez, Colonel Harrison, I'm honored by the recognition and the opportunities you're presenting, but I need to understand how these consulting responsibilities would affect my primary duties as a nurse and security specialist at this hospital.
The consulting work would be conducted remotely whenever possible, with occasional travel for on-site assessments and training delivery, Martinez explained. Your day-to-day responsibilities at Riverside would remain unchanged, but your expertise would be available to protect medical facilities that face similar threats. The military medical facilities we're asking you to assess are treating wounded personnel who depend on security measures that could mean the difference between successful recovery and becoming casualties of terrorist attacks, Harrison added. Your protocols could save the lives of service members who have already sacrificed for their country. Diana looked out the conference room window at the cardiac wing, where she'd found her purpose as a healer, recognizing that the choice before her was fundamentally the same decision she'd faced during the terrorist attack, whether to use all of her capabilities in service of protecting innocent lives, or to limit herself to the narrow role that felt safer and more comfortable.
I accept the consulting contract, she said quietly, with the understanding that my primary responsibility remains patient care at Riverside Medical Center, and that any consulting work supplements rather than replaces my duties here. Agreed, both officials said simultaneously. As they conclude the meeting, Diana realized that she had finally achieved the integration she'd been seeking since leaving Special Forces, a way to use both her medical expertise and her security capabilities in service of healing rather than warfare. The quiet nurse who had tried to hide her past was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength came from using every skill at your disposal to protect the people who depended on you. Later that evening, as Diana completed her rounds in the cardiac wing, she paused at room 318, where Ambassador Richardson's wife had recovered from her ordeal 6 months earlier. The room now housed an elderly gentleman recovering from bypass surgery, but Diana still remembered the night when this space had been the center of a terrorist operation that had forced her to confront everything she'd tried to leave behind. "Nurse Kowalski," the patient called softly, "could you check my monitors? I'm having trouble sleeping." Diana entered the room and performed the routine assessment that had become second nature during 3 years of nursing practice, noting vital signs that indicated normal post-surgical recovery and stress levels that suggested the patient's insomnia was more psychological than medical. "Everything looks normal, Mr. Johnson," she said in the gentle tone she'd perfected for comforting anxious patients. "Sometimes it takes a few days to adjust to sleeping in the hospital environment. Is there anything specific that's keeping you awake?" "I keep thinking about that terrorist attack they had here a few months ago. I know it's probably silly, but I worry about whether something like that could happen again." Diana adjusted his blankets and checked that his call button was within easy reach, performing the small acts of care that reminded her why she'd chosen nursing over continued military service. "Mr. Johnson, I can promise you that this hospital has implemented comprehensive security measures to prevent similar incidents. You're safe here, and your only job is to focus on healing." "The nurse who stopped those terrorists," he said quietly, "I heard she still works here. Is that true?" Diana smiled and moved toward the door, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found peace with both aspects of her professional identity. "Yes, sir, she's still here, and she's still taking care of patients just like you. Sleep well, Mr. Johnson. Someone is always watching over you." As she completed her rounds and prepared to end another shift, Diana reflected on the journey that had brought her from Special Forces operator to civilian nurse to integrated healthcare security specialist. She had finally learned to be fully herself, both healer and protector, using every skill she possessed in defense of the mission that had always defined her, keeping people safe so they could go home to the ones they loved. The legend of Falcon had returned, but this time it was balanced by the expertise of Diana Kowalski, RN, Clinical Operations Security Specialist, who understood that sometimes the most important battle you fight is the one that prevents other battles from ever needing to happen. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.